On June 16, 1959, the company at the Los Angeles home of actor George Reeves was having a good time. The host strummed his guitar, the guests drank and talked. Then, around 1 a.m., a tired George retired to the second floor and, according to his fiancée, a gunshot rang out about 5 minutes later. Strangely enough, this investigation was conducted after a sleeve. The guests didn't call the police until an hour after the incident. There were no crime scene photos. The bloody sheets were immediately put in the washing machine. The hands of the dead George Reeves, known for his role as Superman, were not tested for gunpowder residue. Police did not check Reeves' bedroom for foreign fingerprints and ignored the presence of strange bruises and abrasions on the dead man's hands and head. A naked Reeves was lying on the bed with his legs down, and the gun he allegedly shot himself with was found at his feet on the floor. There were no fingerprints on the gun. The body of the deceased had been thoroughly washed, and there was a man behind it. Eddie Mannix, Louis Meyer's right-hand man, ran a special department at MGM Studios that kept unwanted details of the colorful lives of Hollywood actors under wraps. So if the star was in trouble, everyone knew who to call. Eddie could solve any problem. He had his own people in the press, the police, the medical community, and the mafia. Call Mannix. He'll take care of it. That call guaranteed freedom from trouble, scandalous revelations, rumors, and lawsuits. Remember Platinum, Hollywood blonde Jean Harlow, and the story of her husband Paul Byrne's murder. Mannix was at the top of his game. And Loretta Young, pregnant by a married Clark Gable. Mannix organized the actress' departure, and then made everyone believe that the good-hearted, decent girl had simply adopted someone else's child. The all-powerful Eddie Mannix pulled the scandalous underground film Velvet Lips, starring a then-underage Joan Crawford. Mannix was able to squash incidents involving Spencer Tracy, who had an underage crush, and Clark Gable, who drunkenly ran over a man and fled the scene. Mannix was responsible for everything from forced abortions to sham marriages to unsolved murders. When a man who broke the rules and failed to maintain a proper image needed to be taken out, everything from car accidents to plane crashes were organized. If rumors are to be believed, Eddie Mannix was involved in the death of his first wife, Bernice Fitzmaurice. When Eddie had a mistress, Toni Lanier, a dancer from the Ziegfeld show, he decided to divorce Bernice. Since they were both Catholics, the divorce was delayed and dragged on for several years. On November 18, 1937, Bernice died in an automobile accident, and Mannix began living openly with Toni, whom he later married. Eddie adored his wife, but they still had an open relationship. In 1951, 45-year-old Toni began an affair with George Reeves, who was 8 years her junior. Her lover gave George a pocket watch that read, "Mad About My Boy." It was a story of love and passion between a grown woman, the wife of the head of one of America's largest film companies, and a young, handsome Reeves, who openly took advantage of Toni's position, connections, and wallet. Over time, the relationship with Toni began to drag George, and then there was a new passion in his life. As soon as it seemed to Reeves that he was becoming independent, he immediately broke out of the clinging embrace of Toni. Leonor Lemon, a little-known actress and life promoter from New York City, a glamorous socialite, before meeting George Reeves was married to a millionaire Vanderbilt, though only for 8 days, and then left for the musician. After meeting Leonor, George broke up with Toni Mannix because he was totally in love with Ms. Lemon. And this after so many years with Toni Mannix, her incredibly generous gifts, including cars and a house in Los Angeles, and trips to expensive resorts. There were persistent rumors that Reeves' acquaintance with Leonor was orchestrated by the cunning Eddie Mannix to give the boy another gift that would eventually ruin him. The meeting of Reeves and Lemon took place in a New York restaurant. Polly Brunette, passing by, dazzling smile, and purred, "You have the most beautiful eyes in the world." Of course, she immediately found a seat at his table. They had a wonderful evening and an equally wonderful night together. A whirlwind romance began between Leonor and George, and they became engaged. The couple set a wedding date, June 19, 1959, planned a honeymoon in Tijuana, and on June 16, George Reeves was found in his second-floor bedroom of the Benedict Canyon house with a gunshot wound to the head. Suicide. Murder? George was reportedly planning to call off his wedding to Ms. Lemon. The couple had fought a lot. Leonor was known for her angry outbursts and volatile temper. Facts. 2 months before his death, George Reeves was involved in a car accident. His mechanic reported that the car's brake hoses had been cut. Then strange phone calls began at night. The unknown caller was silent. Later, Reeves' pet dog disappeared. After these events, Reeves went to the police. He suspected Tony Mannix in all of his problems. The court forbade Tony to approach his former lover. And now the events of June 16, 1959. There were several suspects. A random guest at the party. He showed up around midnight, as if he was driving by and saw lights in the windows. William Bliss knew Leonor and the other guests, but not Reeves. Perhaps he had arrived as a hitman sent by Eddie Mannix. Or he was just distracting the guests while someone else upstairs dealt with Reeves. A spurned lover. Tony Mannix. Out for revenge, Reeves could have destroyed partying with company in the house she herself gave George. The aging Tony was very jealous of him with the younger Leonor. Leonor's bride. When the shot rang out, according to one version, Leonor Lemon was in the bedroom with Reeves. Descending to the guests, she asked those present, "Please tell the police that I was down here with you." The news of John Reeves' death came like a thunderbolt. The next day, all the American newspapers carried the headlines, "Superman is dead." The actor who played Superman shot himself in his bedroom. George Reeves' mother, an old lady who lived quietly in Pasadena, California, read the headlines and gasped and sobbed. Mrs. Bessolo loved her beloved son. Helen Bessolo, by her first husband Brewer. Donald Brewer ran away from home as soon as George was born. It was not easy to raise a son. She did not receive alimony, and she had to earn a living. But her luck was not smiling. Helen tried to bake cakes for sale, but the business did not work. Opened a cafe. The business failed. Then she was hired as a secretary, and after she lost the job, she became a waitress in a restaurant. She fought like a fish against the ice just to keep her son fed and decently dressed. George never upset his mother. He grew up an obedient boy, studied well, played sports. What should she do now? What will she live for? Who would pay her bills? She owed this new house to George. He was sending in an impressive amount of money every month. George Reeves, until then, content with small roles, after the adventures of Superman, overnight became the favorite of all American boys and a regular at Hollywood receptions. He was young, handsome, and charismatic. A man like that was unlikely to commit suicide. Neither George's friends nor his mother believed the conclusion of the coroner who examined Reeves' body. When Helen learned that the murder case would not be opened, she was outraged. It took her a week to sell the jewelry her son had given her and to mortgage the house at the bank. She asked a neighbor to take care of her cat and flowers, and took a bus to Los Angeles to find her son's killer. When she reached her destination, Helen felt so out of place on the street among these funky people in expensive suits, luxurious mansions, open cars, palm, and orange trees. She clutched tightly to her purse, which contained an impressive wad of bills and a sheaf of George's letters that would reveal the truth of what had happened. Mrs. Bessolo approached the policeman and asked how she could find the best detective agency in town. An hour later, the old lady was telling the head of the agency, Nick Harris, "My son was wonderful, and there was no sign of depression or anything sad in his letters. He couldn't have killed himself." Nick, a wiry man with a bulldog jaw and a tenacious stare, was getting a little tired of the persistent lady with the sensitive curls. But he had to get on with his work, so he asked, Mrs. Besselo, why do you and your son have different surnames? You see, my first husband left me with little George. When the boy was 5 years old, I met Frank Besselo. He seemed like a good man, and I married him soon after. He treated George with great affection and adopted him. Frank brought all the money into the house, taught George to box, and trained him. But I was always against boxing. You can't disfigure such a beautiful face. After all, the son was so handsome. Helen's shoulders shook and tears streamed from her eyes. Harris felt sorry for the poor woman and handed her a glass of water. Drink it, please. I promised I'll try to help you. Yes, I will. Thank you, Mr. Harris. What's your last name? Mrs. Besselo. Yes, the Anglo-Saxon name Reeves looks much better on the movie poster than the Italian Besselo. But I hope you don't mind if I give the job to a guy who also has an Italian surname. Nick opened the door and called to the secretary. Get Milo Spirillo for me. A few minutes later, Spirillo walked in, a nice young man who for some reason had not settled into the Los Angeles Police Department and decided to try his hand at private investigation. Miles Spirillo knew something about Superman's death, and a lot of things seemed strange to him. The circumstances of his death at the party. No one was confused by the fact that suicides usually didn't go naked, and their hands and faces were covered with gunpowder residue and powder burns. But even stranger was Reeves' will. Helen had been worried with good reason. George had left her only half of his money. Everything else, including the house in Los Angeles, was to go not to his fiancée, Leonore, but to Tony Mannix. Mrs. Besselo was paying the agency $50 a day and wanted quick results. But this gave the detectives something to think about. George's film career began in 1939 when he got the role of Stuart Tarleton, one of Scarlett O'Hara's admirers in Gone with the Wind. It was a supporting role, but he and Fred Crane as Brent Tarleton were in the very first scene of the film and were memorable. Reeves and Crane had their hair dyed the same red color to resemble twins. After Gone with the Wind was filmed, George was noticed, and the Warner Brothers studio signed him to a contract. With the outbreak of World War II, George enlisted as a volunteer and went to serve in the Air Force. Soon, the photogenic guy was transferred to the propaganda department, where he starred in patriotic videos. After the war, he returned to Hollywood. In the series about Superman, he came to try without much enthusiasm. No one expected from the project of such success. George kept his private life secret. He married the actress Eleanor Needles very young. There were no children in the marriage. The couple lived quite poorly, but in harmony. When her husband fell into popularity, Eleanor with resentment noted how George scoots money and a lot of drinking, and women hang on him. Eventually, they separated. After many years of romance with Tony Mannix, George became infatuated with Leonore. Tony threw a tantrum at Reeves in a restaurant and tried to slap him, but he caught her hand. Tony screamed, "Traitor, you'll be sorry." Time passed, but the case did not move. Mrs. Besselo paid money to private investigators, but she learned nothing new about her son's death. The stack of bills grew thinner and thinner, and the old woman cut back on everything. She stayed in a cheap hotel and ate whatever she could. One day followed another, and Helen did not know how to go on. The emotional wounds were not healed, and there was no clarity in the case. One afternoon, the porter called Mrs. Besselo to her room and told her that she was expected in the lobby. She went downstairs. In a chair sat a lady in a strict English suit and dark glasses. It was Tony Mannix. Helen was astonished. She could not digest this woman. Tony stood up abruptly and said in a sobbing voice, "We both love the same man, and we have a lot to talk about." Mrs. Besselo invited Tony into her room. The women sat down in a tiny room filled with cheap furniture. Tony's voice was shaking. She started a sentence and then stopped. Finally, Mrs. Mannix pulled herself together and murmured, "It wasn't like the paper said." "What was it like? Tell me." George and I started seeing each other again. He complained to me that Leonor was cheating on him. There would be no wedding, no trip to Mexico. George realized how wrong he was about Leonor and said he only wanted me. That's when he changed his will. Do you think he could have killed himself? No, of course not. He loved me and he wanted to live. What happened then? Leonor Lemon can answer this question. The old woman was determined that the truth should prevail and was willing to do anything. She persuaded Milo Spirillo to meet the girl, but Leonor flatly refused. Then Mrs. Besselo decided to go to Miss Lemon herself. She did not answer her calls or letters, so Helen kept watch outside her house. Against the backdrop of the magnificent entrance, the little old woman in the shabby suit seemed a mere misunderstanding. A tall brunette in a fancy coat came down the stairs and walked to the car. Mrs. Besselo called to her. Leonor turned to see an older lady coming toward her. Miss Lemon said, "I have only half an hour. Let's go to the nearest cafe." The conversation was strange. Leonor was afraid to say too much and answered evasively. Mrs. Besselo asked her to talk about George's last days and hours. "George was very fond of you and often remembered you." In 30 minutes, Leonor said goodbye and left town that evening. Afterwards, Mrs. Besselo realized that her son had been murdered and that justice would never be served. She did not like the detective from Nick Harris' department. She had probably been assigned the youngest and most inexperienced detective. The money had been thrown away, and she'd never known the truth. But Helen was wrong. Milo knew his business and did not stand idly by. According to his former boss at the Los Angeles Police Department, Leonor was connected to Lucky Luciano, the head of organized crime. One of Reeves' friends warned him shortly before the tragic events. "Stay away from that girl." Tony confirmed this and even showed Reeves a picture of Lucky and Leonor embracing. An unsigned article soon appeared in a Los Angeles newspaper. Superman outdid himself and managed to horn Lucky Luciano himself. A friend of Reeves assured that George was in shock at the time. The association with Luciano's mistress could put a damper on his movie career. George then decided to break up with Leonor and called off the wedding. Milo asked the interviewer, was he planning to go back to Tony? No, of course not. The lady was crazy in love with Reeves and made up her own damn mind. She'd long believed that she and George lived like two lovebirds. She had besieged George with phone calls and waited for him in his car in front of his house. He even returned all her gifts, but she wouldn't accept them. So George rewrote his will, giving Tony almost everything he had. Tony's all right, but look at her husband. Miles Spirillo did. He quickly found out that Eddie Mannix knew the editor of the newspaper that printed the unfortunate article. Mannix was spinning his web like a spider, keeping a close eye on what was going on between Reeves, Leonor, and his wife. Leonor knew that Reeves was going to leave her. If Lucky demanded an explanation from her, she'd probably get away with it, but Reeves would be devoured. An older man accustomed to great power could forgive a confused, unhappy woman, but never a man who insulted him. And now Milo Spirillo had guessed what had happened at Reeves' house in Benedict Canyon. Anyway, the case was closed, and it wasn't safe to reopen it. Suicide, period. Nick Harris Detective Agency washed its hands of the case, and poor Mrs. Besselo spent long hours at the newspaper offices with a thick stack of letters, pestering her son's friends with questions. The mother's heart could not rest. She never returned to Pasadena. Helen died about 6 months later in Los Angeles. Leonor Lemon lived a reclusive life, drank heavily, and never returned to Los Angeles. She died alone in New York City in 1989. Tony Mannix outlived her husband and inherited his entire fortune. Tony set up a George Reeves museum in one of the rooms of her apartment, collecting everything related to him. Portraits of Superman, school satchels with his image, comic books, magazines, and movies. In the evenings, she would turn on the projector and Superman would come to life on the screen. Tony grew older, rarely left the house, and couldn't get enough of her great love.